talking about racial healing and division and the separation that happens so much, but particularly what we've seen demonstrated in St. Louis is a definite pain and heartache. And how does a follower of Jesus respond and step into it and bring about the presence of Jesus in the midst of heartache in our city? You just mentioned the word racial division, and that brings awkwardness and uncomfortable and makes everyone back up a little bit. And it's not just this fun, easy topic for us. It makes it emotional for us in many spectrums all over the place. So we want to approach this with humility, approach it with the grace of Jesus, and help us to understand. I hope you know me well enough that I want us to follow Jesus and understand, what does God speak to us? This church as a whole, we're people of the Word. We're to understand the Word. And we believe that it speaks to our day currently where we're at. The word prejudice, the definition is dislike, hostility, or unjust behavior deriving from unfounded opinions. That's the definition of it. Sometimes we could say, well, this person did this to me one time or said this, so it is a just opinion. The trouble is we take one instant and we turn that around and we throw it off on a whole group of people. And we're talking this on both sides, all sides of the fence, we do it. We categorize all groups of people as a certain skin color or certain age grouping or a certain group that lives in this area, neighborhood. We categorize people, and many times it's unfounded. Synonyms for the word prejudice are bigotry, partiality, discrimination, inequality. Those are horrible words. Those are mean words. None of us want to be identified as a person that possesses one of these, but they go hand in hand with this hurt and the pain that's all around us. Appreciate hearing Matt Chandler say one time the word gospel means good news. We know that. When it says good news, it implies that there must be some bad news out there that the good news is calling us out from. And certainly there's some bad news all around this racial divide that we face, and the gospel speaks to it with good news. So we want to hear that good news today. This past week, we honored the death of a man named Martin Luther King Jr. This man of God, this pastor 50 years ago faced some horrible injustices, and he led this revolution that stood for so much. It's so important. One of the things he said was the church is still the most segregated hour in America. He said that 50 some years ago. Unfortunately, it's still true today. Now, it reflects the community that we live in, but still so many times it's segregated and separated. And the church should be a place that reflects the glory of heaven and the glory of God's love for all people. 55 years ago, this man was in a jail in Birmingham, and he actually wrote a letter. He's a pastor writing a letter to other pastors, other churches, specifically to white churches. And in this letter, I ran it off last week and just read it again. It's just heartbreaking letter where he's appealing to people to live out the grace of Jesus. One of the phrases I took from that, he said, speaking to the church back in the 60s, if today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club. And how true, 55 years later, so many people look at church as irrelevant. It's just this social club. It doesn't infect the community. It doesn't bother to live in the community. It separates himself away from. Now, we're supposed to live separate from all the sin and the heartache of the world in some ways, but we're supposed to be Jesus to the community, and we see Jesus reaching out to hurting people wherever he went. He certainly reached out to those of a different race. This is true for us. Too many times people look at the church as this irrelevant social club, and it should be very relevant because the gospel is good news. Last week, Angie Rudolphi sent me an email, and she quoted or sent me an article by Katie Ganshert, who lives here in St. Louis. And Katie wrote this. One of the phrases I pulled out says, we want Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. We like that one, but not his letter from the Birmingham jail, where he calls out the white moderate, quote, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And this is a fair statement. I just want there to be peace. I just want us to get along. Can we just all be okay? Just get rid of the tension. Just stop talking about it. Let everything be okay, and then everything's fine. That's false peace. Absence of tension. Can we get to the point where we say we want true justice? We want there to be healing in how we work and live and serve together. In the 1960s, churches were singing songs about peace, while outside on the streets was these horrible, painful injustices going on all around them. And they just kind of closed their doors. 3 years ago, in 2014, in August, there were riots that broke out in our community, and it was so heartbreaking and scary for everybody. It's what's happening, and media got in and made this huge mess of it, but it was still there, and we didn't know what to do about it. And in November that same year, they erupted again, and so many were asking, why is this there? Why are we doing this? What's happening, and why is this going on? We had all of our reasons come around to it, and then the fall of last year, November 2017, we have riots break out again. And this fear arises, this anger, the emotion, it's all there. And as a church, as an individual, as a follower of Jesus, how do we respond to that? What do we speak into? We don't want to be like the 60s where we just kind of lock our doors and huddle down. But how do we speak into this pain and the heartache all around us? And let me say very clearly, as we look at this for a couple of weeks, this is not a political issue we're looking at. We're looking at a biblical issue. You hear that? We're not looking at politics. We're not looking at programs or all that kind of stuff out there. We're going to talk about biblical issue. How do we respond to this? And we can say clearly there's racism in this room because we're people. That's just how we function. It's just here. And it's just an Anglo issue. It's on both sides, all sides of it. And it's even within races. We do that towards one another within our races. All races do that. You know, have you ever heard about these uppity white-collar people and these prideful rednecks over on the other side of the fence? Is there racism there? Do we size each other up? I mean, what's the big question in St. Louis? Where did you go to? And the response is, oh, right? Oh, you grew up there. Oh, you're that group. Oh, you're that school. We size each other up, and we do that. We do it with each other. It's just called how we function, how we live. And Kathy, who was up on the stage, she sent me a song this week by Mandisa. It's that we all bleed the same. It's a beautiful song. Saying, why can't we get past this surface stuff and realize we are all the same? That we size each other up. And we just got back from India, where we were at a month ago. And you go into India, and this beautiful people. I love the culture, the people that are there. But wherever you're born into a caste. Whatever that caste is, that's where you'll be the rest of your life. And you're born to this family, this name, and this part of the country, then you are at the bottom of the barrel, the lowest caste, and that's where you'll spend the rest of your life. If you're born to this family, then you're the upper caste and you're important. No matter what you do in life, that's who you are. And being born does not make you superior to anybody else, period. That country, it's so blatant, it's so out there. In fact, if a really wealthy person, the high caste, walks on the street and the low caste is there, they have to get off the street. In fact, they have to get away from, so not even their shadow can touch this person because they're not even worthy of the shadow. That is horrible. But yet we can do the same thing. We can size people up by where they're from and where they're at, and we do it within our own groups. It's there. We talk about dominant culture. If I mention white privilege, it just makes you mad, doesn't it? Just goes, ooh, don't even get off on there. But it's just a fact. It's a reality. It's called majority. When you have a majority culture, a majority group of people, that has a big influence on those around. Think back to grade school. The most popular kids, didn't you want to be a part of that group? Because they were the majority. They could do things. They had privilege over others because they were dominant there. It's just how people function. It's how we live. And for us to understand it, recognize it is so important. If you don't see it and you're Anglo, it's because you're Anglo and you just don't see it. A couple weeks ago, I called Mike Barbarkas, a member of our church, and I said, Mike, I'm really struggling. I'm trying to work through this, and I'm just stuck on this one area. And he says, well, Doyle, you're thinking like a white man. I go, well, what is that supposed to mean? And he goes, well, you're just thinking like you're a white guy. And I go, well, I am, and how do I help? And he had to talk me through some stuff, and I'm trying really hard, but we need those points where people speak into us and say, this is what is going on. If we say, what is the big deal? I don't get it. What's the problem? That's a problem because we don't get it. Now, you're not bad for not getting it. But let's be Jesus and say, I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to bring the gospel to people who need it. How do we do that? How do we reach out? I want to take a look at some scripture. In Acts, the 10th chapter, we see Peter, who is this Jewish man, going to a place in Joppa, And he's at this guy's house, it's Simon's house, and he gets there, and he's going to talk to a group of people. Now, let's recognize there's two different groups of people. There's a group that comes together, we huddle together. We call that a homogeneous group. So a homogeneous group collects with people who are just like them. In fact, the definition of that is all of the same kind, alike. We all do that. We all like to be with groups of people who are just like us. We do it by age grouping. We want to be around other people the same age as we are. We want to be around people the same economic level because we're comfortable that way. We're attracted to people of the same family status. They got small kids, I got small kids, we're attracted together, or seniors over here, or singles, because we're attracted to people who are like us. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we always stay in our comfortable group where it's easy and never stretch ourselves to reach out to others, we miss out on so much of life. And recognizing we need to stretch ourselves and be Jesus to different people. We're going to find Peter was pushed in that direction. He's in Joppa, he's interacting with people, and he goes up on top. There's a house, it was a flat area, he goes up there to pray. And while he's up there praying, he gets a vision from God. There's a sheet coming down from heaven, and he looks at that sheet, and there's got all these different animals, and there's unclean animals, and the voice says, you go kill and you eat. And Peter says, I'm not gonna eat those. I've never ate anything unclean in my life. I follow the dietary laws. And 3 times that happens, the voice says, you go kill and eat, because then the voice says, God says, nothing I have made is impure or unclean. And there's a knock on the door. And he goes downstairs, and it's a guy coming from up by Caesarea by the sea, way up north, comes down and says, Cornelius, the head of our household, has had a vision from God that we are to follow you, and you're supposed to come and teach us about God. Now, what's interesting is these men are Gentiles, a different race. Peter's response in verse 28 of Acts chapter 10 is this. He said to them, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to even associate with a Gentile or visit him. But God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean. Peter realized he wasn't just talking about food, this vision, but it was that God creates all of us the same way. And up to this point, Peter would not have even talked to a Gentile, let alone had a meal with him, interacted with him, because the racial division was so harsh and so strong. And so he goes up there, he travels up, he enters the house, and he begins the conversation like this, down in verse 34. It says, then Peter began to speak, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear him and do what is right. So that's our starting point, is to recognize that God gives value to every nation, every person. God says, I've created every person, every living person is created in the image of God, and God gives value to it, and we need to reflect the same way. It is a race issue in the Bible, and it is for us as well. We see him going on, that he begins to speak to them and teach them. They all responded. The Holy Spirit shows up. It's a great thing. They all accept Jesus. They're all baptized, and it says he stayed for a period of days. And it's interesting because before this day, Peter would not even have talked to one of them, let alone had a meal with them. Now he's staying in their home, spending days with them, interacting. Chapter 11, he goes back to Jerusalem. He gets to Jerusalem, and boy, it's a big blow up. People in Jerusalem are saying, I can't believe this. I heard that you were in their home. I heard that you baptized them. How could you do that with this different race of people? How could you do it? It's a big blow up. And Peter goes through the entire story in chapter 11, explains the whole thing. At the end of it, finally, the church in Jerusalem turns around and says, this is good. We celebrate with you. So it sounds like a good ending to the story, but it's not. You go over the book of Galatians and we see Peter is interacting with the Gentiles and celebrating and doing well, and they're doing fine. And then look at verse 11, Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. It says, when Peter came from Antioch, I opposed him to his face. This is Paul. I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. Now, the James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He said before they showed up, he was eating with the Gentiles, having a great time, and all of a sudden, this group of critics show up from Jerusalem and Peter all of a sudden changes. Going on. It says, when they arrived, Peter began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group, this group of Jews. So Peter's fine, he interacted with another race, it's all good, and all of a sudden this group of critics shows up, and he goes, wait, and he backs up. Going on verse 13, says, the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I love that, truth of the gospel lived out, I said to Peter in front of them all, you're a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile, says you're interacting with them, and not like a Jew. How is it that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? He's saying, how is it you are just fine? You were just eating a bacon sandwich, and they show up, and now you're acting like I have nothing to do with them, and you're running off over here. It's like that peer pressure you faced way back when you were in school. It's like, I'm friends with you, everything's fine, and then, the popular people showed up, and so then you act like a jerk, and you turn over and you start acting like them. Do you remember those days? He's doing this as an adult. He's doing this as a man who followed Jesus for 3 years. Has saw Jesus do these incredible things in the day of Pentecost from all those different nations. Saw Jesus do this with Cornelius. And still, when pressure shows up, other people show up. Someone from my work shows up. My family member shows up. My neighbor shows up. All of a sudden, he turns around and he reverts off and he backs off and he's like, I'm too good for this. He changes. It's wrong. It was a racial divide. Even though he worked through it, it was still in his heart. And we all have those blind spots. We think we're doing fine, and then something like that, it's like, whoa, why did I just do that? You know, those blind spots are hard to see. And we need to have someone who's real honest, like Paul was to Peter, and stand up and say, Doyle, you're wrong. This is wrong what you're doing. Now, preferably, if you're going to do that to me, don't do it like Paul did in front of a whole group of people. All right, pull me off to the side first. That'd be better. But we need someone to speak to you. And you know the best person to speak to you? You say, I don't think I'm prejudiced. I'm going to be fine. Go up to someone of a different race and say, do you think I'm prejudiced? Do you think I come across this way? And let them speak truth to you in your areas of blind spots. Let's go to the book of Ephesians. See the truth here. He's speaking about this racial divide between the Jews and the Gentiles. Ephesians 2, verse 12 says, remember that at that time, he's speaking to the Gentiles, you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenant of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. So there's a time, Gentiles, this is anybody that's not a Jew, all races that are not Jews. Remember, you are over here. Verse 13, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. Because what Jesus did on the cross, now you're brought in. In verse 14, for he himself, Jesus, is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. Now let me explain that a little bit. He's saying because Jesus came to give peace, because he did that, he broke down this dividing wall. So Jesus breaks down dividing walls, literally. The things that separated Gentiles from Jews, this racial divide, he said Jesus came and he broke those walls down, literally. Go back to the temple on that day. When they go to Jerusalem to worship God, they came up there. Gentiles were allowed, God-fearing Gentiles. They'd go through ceremonial cleansing. They went in through the first gate of the temple courts. So they could go in, they could worship God there. But there was another. There was literally what's called a dividing wall and a gate. Gentiles were not allowed to go through that. Women could. Jewish women could. So the Jewish women could go into the second gate. And there was another dividing wall. That dividing wall said no one else can come through here except for Jewish men who are ceremonial clean. So we have these dividing walls. Jews can come this far and you stop. Women can come this far and you stop. Jewish men could go further. Those were literally dividing walls. And when Jesus came, he got rid of those. There's no separation between them. So recognizing Jesus breaks down the dividing walls. Interesting, archaeology, when they were excavating around the western wall and the southern gates, as they're going through, they found some of the inscriptions from that early temple of those courtyards around the outside of it. And one of them for that Gentile area said this, whoever is captured past this point will have himself to blame for his death. That's a harsh wall. Saying, Gentile, you worship here, but if you cross over this line, you're going to die. In the name of God, of course. How horrible. That's a dividing wall. Going on. It says his purpose, Jesus, was to create to himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace, and in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. So God wants to make these two different races, these two different groups, into one new person. I love that. The cross brings an end to hostility. Hostility, that harsh word. It says the cross, what Jesus paid for, our sins. It says he came to break down those dividing walls, give value to all men, and get rid of the hostility, the anger that separates people that's there. He came to give one. That koinos, that one is new kind, unprecedented, something brand new. Instead of different races, Jesus came so there'd be one people before him. Understanding that racial reconciliation, and those words are harsh, we don't like them, but the idea of how do we come together, it can't be prompted by white guilt. There's nothing wrong with being born white, being born black or brown or Asian. There's nothing wrong with how you're born. That's how God created you. That's good. Understanding we need to reach out and how to live with one another. The desire to live out the gospel. In the midst of this painful world, how are we going to live it out? Just that going up to someone saying, hey, can I be your friend? I need to learn a bit. I just want to be your friend. And so do that. Find someone who's a different race and you can go ask him. And sorry if you're a minority and you have 20 people asked to be your friend today, but take it well, all right? In the sense of we just need to learn. And we can say I'm not, but if I don't have any relationships, and it's not more than just a surface level, but learn how to sit down with someone and have a meal together and talk and understand. Be patient with one another. Anything that's done racist or hurtful in this church, we should call out to one another. Say, this is wrong. Because we want to grow together. To have diversity in our life, you need to live in humility. Get rid of the pride. And say, how do I lift you up? How do I love you? And when we live out the gospel in a beautiful way, it's demonstrated to the whole world. And it does make a difference. The gospel heals, the gospel works when we live like Jesus. Now, to help us understand this in a personal way, I've asked Chris and Miranda to come and just join me on the stage and just let me just have a conversation with them in front of you. So would you welcome Chris and Miranda out here on the stage? Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me. I'm glad you're here. Everybody say hi, Chris and Miranda. Hi. We're glad you're here. So, Miranda, you were singing. Beautiful. Thank you for doing that. Chris, you maybe not seen him. He was back here in the cage. They keep him locked up. You were beating those drums. You sounded great with that. Thank you very much. So we're glad you're here. So a lot of people don't know. You don't know everybody here, do you?
No.
Okay, so tell us your story. So tell us so we know something about you.
Okay, so we're both from Chicagoland area, a suburb of Chicago called Markham, Illinois. And we actually was raised in a church. I came up through a church. And my mom was a product of an interracial relationship. And she was very adamant about us going to church no matter what. We really didn't have a choice. We went because she said go to church. Right. So developed my own relationship with Christ. And I thought everything was great. The church that we came up in was a mixed church. It was a lot of whites, but it was a few black families and Italian families, Hispanic families, and so on. But through that, I never thought race was something that we really talked about in February on Black History Month. It wasn't anything that we had that was ongoing every month or every week that we had to really deal with. Through that, she really showed us just base our relationships on how we're treated. So if they treat you nice, then, no matter what, treat them nice. And if they treat you nice, then be their friend. But if not, then they don't want to be your friend, so have nothing to do with them. So that's kind of the way that we were raised. It wasn't a black thing or a white thing. It was just a treatment. If they treat you nice, then that's great. If they don't, you don't treat them bad. You just let them be about their way and find someone else. So that's how she taught us, and that's how we came up in our church.
Okay. Chris and I grew up in the same town. We both grew up in Markham, but we didn't meet until we were adults.
Okay.
So that was common. We were both also raised by single moms and also raised in churches, multicultural churches. So the church where I grew up was a different church from Chris's, although it was right down the way, was mostly white families, a few black families, one really big Indian family, and that guy later became the senior pastor of the church. And so I kind of grew up with everyone at that church. As a matter of fact, in our church, it was about a sanctuary this size, maybe even larger, and we had flags all the way around. And then I went to the adjacent Christian school there. So I'm a church kid, raised in church, and then raised around all kinds of people. So the church, again, was not unlike this congregation. So when we came here, it felt very familiar for us. But where we differ is that I was raised with a keen awareness of Blackness or being Black. So African American pride was something that was a big part of our family, African American art on the wall, celebrations, and so I was always raised with a very strong sense of self and a sense of pride. Also, at the same time, I started playing the violin when I was 3, so I was always in classical music and went on to study classical music throughout high school, and so I was also always the only Black person in the room. At that time, there weren't many little brown girls who were excelling in music the way I was. So this is something that wasn't unfamiliar, that is not familiar, it's not unfamiliar for us. So yeah,
That's your story. Well, I
my
grew up,
story.
as everybody knows, on a farm. And it was a white community, white church, very much different from you guys, as a diverse culture. There was a family that moved to town when I was in high school that was a Black family. And he became the most popular kid in school because everybody wanted to be his friend because he was different. So it wasn't bad, but it was just different. So our groups, our areas that we grow up in shape us and how we think and how we process. And so you moved to St. Charles, wonderful place to live. And of course, you've never faced any racism here whatsoever, right?
No, Pastor, that is just not true.
No, not true at all. All right. So tell us about it. So what's it like to live in St. Peter's?
Okay. It's been different. It's very different. That's the word I use all the time these last 4 years. We've been here for 4 years now. From the Chicago area. So one instance, a couple of months ago, my youngest son, who is 6 and in first grade, came home from school, and he had these big crocodile tears in his eyes, and he was telling me how a little boy told him on the bus that his skin color doesn't belong here. And he's just boo-hooing, and I'm trying to convince him that he belongs and you're okay. And at the same time, I'm not really believing the words that I'm offering him because I've struggled with that in my own. You know, these are not isolated events. I've seen racial slurs in the lobby of my workplace, not necessarily directed at me, but just graffiti that's hurtful. I've been called a monkey, get followed in stores.
Sorry.
So these are things that
What do you mean get followed in stores?
just, you know, when you're out shopping and I guess you get pegged as a person who steals, so the loss prevention people follow you around the store to make sure that you're not stealing, or the associates. And some days, I can shake it off if I'm in esteem, and then some days it gets tiring, it's frustrating, it's exhausting.
Sorry.
Some days.
Yeah.
Some days you're
I'm
okay.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So
About you, Chris?
yeah, it's different. So within our neighborhood, it's kind of more my speed. I really don't get followed around the store as much like Miranda does with those issues. But in my neighborhood, you know, we're very outgoing people. So we host birthday parties and we do events. You know, we're outgoing people. So our neighbors, we really like to engage with our neighbors. So what troubles me a lot is when the neighbor who we befriend, you know, we've been here 4 years now, same address. We befriend these neighbors and they befriend us back. You know, they'll say hi and very cordial and celebrate anniversaries and holidays with us and even feed our dog and, you know, just everything like that. Wonderful people. But when others come around from the neighborhood, then they pretend like they don't even know who we are at all. Not even to the point of not even acknowledging us when we acknowledge first to say, hi, how are you? Hey there. And they pretend as if they didn't hear me. Or in the store, we'll be coming down the same aisle and we're like, hey, how's it going? Hey, how you doing? And no response at all. Like, I guess maybe the cornflakes was more important than saying hi to me or something.
Oh.
And when we're in the neighborhood and around like that, it's just, it really hurts to get treated that way.
Yeah.
When just yesterday you were nice and kind and asking me about our business or asking us about our kids.
So it's kind of like Peter.
Yes,
When he's with you, he's fine, but when the other
Yes.
people come around, he changes.
yes, very much
sorry.
so. Yes.
So This is an odd question, but when I'm in a group where I'm the extreme minority, I feel unsafe. We live in St. Peter's. I would think everything's good here, but do you feel safe? Does that just...
Yeah, in certain times, in certain situations, I do. And there's oftentimes here, I mean, you can tell that you can look even in the congregation right now, there's very few brown to white that is in the audience. So this is an environment where we are the minority.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that I don't feel safe all the time when it's that kind of environment. But in the streets, in the city, sometimes I do. And a lot of the times the things that we talk about with Miranda and with the kids is how to perform and how to act when you're out. This is not the time for you to express your opinion. And we have 2 young-year-olds, 6 and 7, then we have an older one who's a freshman in college. So the last thing that we want is to get a phone call from someone saying that something happened with all of these mitigating circumstances and this and that and happen and come down and see him laid out somewhere. That's like one of the fears that we have. So we had to teach them, this is what you do, this is how you act, this is what you say. And it's really a script that we must stick to, that they'll know and that they'll recite, and it'll be like really second nature to them when they're in a situation like that, because we're just not treated equally.
And those are conversations you have to have with your son that I never had with mine.
Right.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Absolutely. So there are days when I definitely don't feel safe, and some of that is a combination of what's happening in our world and so many painful and heartbreaking events. But a lot of those things, when we see them, I can relate to the people who are on the receiving end of that. And so definitely worried about my sons, 3 sons, and is this the moment, or is this the moment where I or one of them will have to face overt racism, or is this the day when one of them happens to lose their life because of overt racism? And it is a fear, raising sons, that I carry. So definitely want to, have that conversation with him, and we call it the talk. And then there are times, like you mentioned, the riots last fall, and some of the protesters last fall came over the bridge, and I was watching the news story about it, and they were doing it live, and then I started seeing comments of people that were saying things like N-words, stay over there, don't bring that stuff over here, N-words, we left North City, we left you guys in North City or North County, and that, it rattled me, because these were people that I know, and these are people that we work with, or one of them was my brother-in-law's coworker, and we're saying, oh my gosh, we're not welcome here. When we moved here, we didn't realize that this wasn't a multicultural area. Yeah. So when people, they ask us, so are you from North City? We're like, no, we live in St. Peter's. Well, did you used to live in North City? No, we live in St. Peter's. So that conversation, which is kind of benign and funny, but it echoes that you don't really belong here. So there are times when, that fear grips me. Another time I was driving down the street behind a guy, this was just recently, and he stopped at a stoplight, a white pickup truck, and he jumped out of the car, and the fear gripped my heart. It's just that moment, that overt racism I'm gonna face. Am I safe? Are my kids safe? Navigating all that, what will I say? How are we? Do I call somebody right away? And his story had nothing to do with my story. He was only jumping out to check on something in the bed of his pickup truck. But that fear that I'm carrying kind of glazes over everybody. And I haven't said this in the past services, but I want to apologize, because that fear and that frustration of everything that happened last fall and seeing some comments, it was very hard for me, like the 5 weeks after that, to even come back to church, because I knew that we're the minorities here, and if those white people on that thread felt that way, well, they must feel that way too, and that is prejudice, and so I do want to apologize for that.
No, I understand. But we do. We make assumptions that
Yes.
everybody thinks that way, and I appreciate hearing the other way around, and I'm sorry that it's fear that you live in, but fear is what we live in on both sides of it. And it's where we want the gospel to come in. And speaking into that, how do we do that? So what's it like being in our church? It's the most wonderful place on earth, right?
Awesome.
Yeah, that's good.
It is a great church. It is
Yeah,
an awesome
okay, good.
church.
But we should just leave it there and go on then, maybe. But Lily, what does it feel like being in our church? How do we do with this?
For the most part, it's great. Church is great. Well, this church is, like Miranda said, is very, very similar to what grew up in our whole lives. This is not unfamiliar. So,
Bible believing, wonderful,
right.
perfect, good.
Yeah, everybody, every black person did not come up in a Baptist or, that kind of church. So that kind of just thought and mentality is just totally off. But coming here, what gets me sometimes, I talk to Miranda about it a lot, when we come in and we get the feeling and the look of a visitor. So we're like, we're not a visitor. Now, some of you that's hard to figure out, but a lot of people here will think of us as visitors. They'll come in and they're like, hi, how are you? Thanks for coming, welcome. Like, okay, all right. Or even when we're here ministering, this is the really, really craziest part. We'll be ministering Saturday night, first service on Sunday. We'll come around and come through the back for something. Yeah. And they're like, oh, hi, welcome. Wait, did you not see
I just
us on the, what is going on? So with those things, it's easy to brush them out and joke about it now, but when you having this conversation here, sitting at this table, you wonder where their mind and where their heart is to not focus on what's, I think, is kind of like right there in front of us. I mean, we're here. We're not visitors, so just treating each one kindly. And even with the looks and the stares that we talked about on Friday, we're different. We're different from you, of course, different from people here sitting. And different is fine. Different is fine. I like what I like, she likes what she likes, you like what you like. Yeah. But how do you get over that difference barrier? So for me, just speak. Just say hi. You don't have to stress out or make it hard. Hey, bro, what's up, my man? The fancy handshake and dapping me and all that. We ain't got to go through all that. Just a wave, a hi, handshake, a bro hug, all those things work for me. We don't have to go real deep and hard into it. But just that step and that reaching out to the next person is
so
really...
let's practice. Everybody, here we go. Hi.
Hi. What? Hi.
How'd we do? Is that all right?
That's perfect.
Good start.
Great start.
That's good.
Great start.
I want to echo, so a lot of what we're talking about is not just Harvester Church. I want to make sure that that's understood that this word, the microaggressions or things that brown people may face, it's not just isolated in any one space. And so at any moment, I could be carrying things, that happened earlier in the day at the store, and then come to church the next day and just be exhausted with it. So I want to be clear that many friends here at Harvester have been just tremendously welcoming, and we've made some great relationships. But what I do want to stress is that in having these conversations and building the relationships, I say this tongue in cheek, but because of the way I've grown up, the way we've grown up, some of my best friends have been white. Some of my best friends have been Indian or Hispanic or Black. So when you're having those conversations, especially if you haven't grown up in diversity, understand that Black people, African American people are not monolithic. And so you can ask 7 people and get 7 different results. Even we, a married couple, have vastly different views and opinions on race, culture, class, and religion. So I would just charge people to meet people for who they are and understand them for who they are and appreciate the richness of who they are outside of that group.
Which is the idea we said, start out with, to give value to all people, no matter who we are, our background, and that we need to come together. One of the best ways to come together is to sit down together, interact, talk, hear each other's stories, share together, share a meal together, and the best one we could do is share in communion together. And so we're going to do that. If you're going to serve communion, would you go back and get the trays at this time for the rest of us, please? And we're just going to come together as a body of believers, recognizing that Jesus breaks down the dividing walls, he takes away hostility, and as we receive communion, we're receiving that grace, that love from Jesus that meets us wherever we're at, no matter what our story, and that's the place we want to live and be. Before him as a body of believers, not just here in this place, wherever we go this week. So as this is given to you, just receive this, pray, and think about the dividing walls of your heart between you and God. Let those go, because he's covered all of our sin. and then ask him to speak in your heart at other areas of your life, living with other people. So you guys go ahead and serve us at this time. What I ask you to do is take the bread and the cup and just hold it, and we're all going to take it together after everybody receives it. So use this time for meditation and prayer, and just hold it, and we'll take it together.
On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took the bread, broke it, and said, "Take, eat. This is my body which was broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me."
In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Let's all partake.
Thank you, Jesus, for loving each one of us and saving us. And help us, Lord, to love and value one another with your love and your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing your story, and thanks for being honest with us and for helping us, and just love you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. That's good.